In this video, we are going to be talking about the multicellular primary producers of the ocean, or things that generate energy for the ocean. So here are different key concepts that you can go back over later. And I want to point out on this slide that there are other things that actually, and we've talked about in other videos, other things that do photosynthesize, but these are the taxonomic groups that we are going to go over today. And you can come back and look at the key concepts more later if you need to, but I'm going to move on with the rest of the presentation. So inside of multicellular algae, there are three different algae that we are going to look at. The red algae, which is here, so beautiful, and then the brown algae, and there's a picture here, and the green algae, and different types of that here. People specifically who study seaweeds are called algologists or phycologists, and there's a whole slew of things that can be studied in this area. I put a picture here of dead man's fingers. It's a green algae that is found in Southern California that I think is so cool looking when you find it. So algae are very economically important to us. Not only are they providing habitat for lots of our fish and other organisms, but they do provide food and various products for us. So these are all different products and foods that have seaweed in them. And names that you can find on labels are highly varied, but some of the common ones are carrageenan, or it'll be called Irish moss, or even alginates. So seaweeds actually can be part of what we call the fouling community, meaning they attach to places where we don't want them, like on boats or docks or other places. Most of them are benthic, though, where they attach to the seafloor, and no one minds that. So benthic seaweeds are usually found on the intercontinental shelf. They do have something called compensation depth, where they grow based on the tide and the amount of light that they get. There's different ways that where they can grow depending on how they are eaten, like the herbivory or the competition with other species for space. There's also different physiological tolerances that they had. Now, a long time ago, it was thought that algae were found at various depths based on their coloration, but that is found now to be not true. So if you've heard that, kind of wipe that from your memory, because different colors can be found at a lot of different depths. So seaweeds are greatest in tropical waters. They just like very even temperatures of the water, but that's not the only limiting factor that they have. And there are some that grow in colder waters and are perennial, meaning they live year round, like in Southern California, where we do have some warmer water in the summer. It's not that warm, but very cold water in the winter. And these algae and seaweeds can actually live 2 years or more. And what they do is in the winter, a lot of times they will shed the top part and just remain or retain the holdfast that will hold on in the bottom, and then regrow when it gets a little bit warmer. In many cases, really extreme temperatures, extreme cold or extreme heat can kill algae. So algae have these flattened parts called the thallus, that is these flattened parts on the blade. A lot of times those hold the reproductive structures. Then there's the holdfast that holds on to some kind of substrate, often like a rock on the bottom. The stipe, which is sort of like a stem. They don't have traditional vascular tissues, roots, stems, leaves. Remember that they are an algae and not a traditional like land-like plant. So the color of the thallus, or the blade that you see there, is obviously the color that's being reflected by the algae, and then the other colors are actually being absorbed and used for energy. So chlorophyll, all the algae have chlorophyll A, but chlorophyll B is really strong in green algae. Chlorophyll C is in brown. Chlorophyll D is in red. And I want to point out here that there are accessory pigments inside of algae where those accessory pigments are not the ones that are actually doing photosynthesis, but they take the light energy that is coming in from the sun and they pass that energy, or they channel that energy to the reaction center where photosynthesis is taking place. So while they're not generating the energy, they are passing energy along that gets used for photosynthesis. And so they're called accessory pigments, which is pretty cool. So their cell walls are made mostly of cellulose, but also many have calcium carbonate in them. And calcium carbonate really can give it like a hard, like almost rocky, sandy feel. And you have to have a stronger mouth in order to break that down or be able to handle it. Many actually, as kind of a multifaceted defense or life history, have a slimy mucilage on them. And that actually, when the tides are really low, the sliminess kind of holds water in so they can still have water, and they can actually take some of their slime, and if there's a bunch of critters trying to eat them, they can actually slough it off as a way to protect themselves. And some actually have a protective cuticle on the outside that is made of protein. So they can reproduce a number of ways by fragmenting, which is breaking off a piece and it floats away and regenerates. They also have asexual reproduction through spore formations where haploid spores are made in the thallus and then released, and they meet up with a mate and they form a sporite stage, and then that stage of the life cycle reproduces or produces spores, which are actually diploid. So they kind of have these two different generations that they flip-flop between. So green algae are a very, very diverse group. They have chlorophyll A and B and carotenoids. They are most are unicellular, but interesting, they have multiple nuclei inside of a single space. And how that happens is that inside the thallus, at times, it will have cellular division, where if you can picture like when a cell divides, there's all these like cell parts that are created, and usually at the very end you have something called cytokinesis, where the cell breaks into two pieces. It basically does everything but the cytokinesis. So it'll go through a whole mitosis division, except not have cytokinesis, where it divides into two. So you'll have multiple nuclei, and it's showing it here in the pictures, floating around in a single space, which is pretty crazy and pretty diverse. There's lots of different forms of green algae. You can have one that, you know, has this traditional shape, or you can have a globular shape, an umbrella shape, branching. Like I said, you can have ones with calcium carbonate that helps in reef formation. There's a lot of different shapes of these guys. So they end up getting eaten and used for food a lot. Green algae do. And so they have different responses to being eaten and how they deal with that. One response is just to tolerate it, and those ones have they release so many sex cells, so many sperm and eggs, that basically it doesn't even matter, because some are just gonna get eaten, and we produce so many that it should compensate and be okay. There's other ones that actually just try to avoid being eaten by growing in hard to reach places like little crevices. Then there's other ones that try to have deterrence and deter something from eating them by, again, depositing those hard calcium deposits that makes it really hard to like chew or digest or break off. But some also have toxins so that other organisms won't eat them. So there are actually some sea slugs that will go and pierce the algae and suck the nutrients out. And interesting, these sea slugs actually keep chloroplasts inside of them, so that now they're kind of photosynthetic animals going around, which just makes them freaking awesome. But here is some pictures of what those sea slugs can look like. Just like this one is just gorgeous, and this one looks like the sheep of the sea. It's like so cool. And then all of them, you can see the green where they retain the chloroplasts from the green algae. That's so awesome. So basically, the life cycle of sea lettuce, that is one type of green algae, is that it has the sporophyte generation, and it will have a male and female version, like gamete. But I want to point out here that these gametes are just, it's a really small picture, but this one is actually designated right here by a minus, and this one is designated by a plus. The reason why they show it that way is it's impossible physically to tell the difference between the sperm and the egg in this version. They look exactly the same, but they know, and they're able to find and join an egg with a sperm to fuse and make a zygote, which is interesting. So red algae is very, very diverse. There's about 6,000 different species, and they can live very deep in the water, like 200 meters. That's so deep. They also absorb blue and green light. So they're multicellular. They're very diverse in their forms. Here's like a close-up of what it can look like inside, which is really cool. They're edible. I've actually eaten them before, and to me they taste like very salty carrots. And here's another picture. So this one's very soft and flowy, and this one here is actually an encrusting coralline red algae, and it actually grows over loose sediment in the ocean, like loose chunks, and it'll grow over all of that and bind it together and be something that actually creates reef for other organisms, which makes it really unique. So red algae does not have any toxins in it. It does have this really hard calcium carbonate, though, that makes it hard to graze on. It has a complex life cycle. This is a video by Smithsonian Tropical Research, Why Study Red Algae. One of the ways it protects itself, though, is by growing in crevices. Then the life cycle of red algae is that different haploid spores will be released by what's called the tetrasporophyte, right here. So these are released, and then you have the male form and the female form. So the sperm are basically non-modal. They can't move. So they just rely on wave currents to just float them over to the female. And then when they join, and if they join, they will fertilize and make eggs. Well, interesting, once they have fertilized and made a little plant, it actually develops its new generation on the female's plants, like parent plant. So they start their life just parasitically living off of their parent plant, until eventually they release different carpospores, and those go and settle and make a new plant. So it's an interesting life cycle there. So red algae will be epiphytes, meaning it'll grow on other plants. There'll be epizoics, where they grow on different animals, and some are actually parasitic on other red algae. And then there are some that are like that coralline one that we were talking about, that will cement pieces of loose sediment together and build reef, which is really awesome. This is just almost like a spoof funny video by someone named Shane in the Wild. SBC presents coralline algae, and it's just showing some coralline algae there, and I wanted to show you what it looks like. And so that's not a serious video, but you can check it out. So there's various human uses of red algae. There's different parts of its cell wall that make it really strong but flexible, like a carbohydrate. Um, so it's used in agar for labs. And here I put a picture of what that looks like. It's used, carrageenan is used as a thickening agent in all of these products. Irish moss is eaten like a pudding. It's used heavily in various Asian cuisines, and it's used as an animal feed and as fertilizer. Here's a video by Marine Diaries, Kelp Forest, the sequoias of the sea. And while these aren't the sequoias, the brown algae in the next slide are. And it makes these awesome forests like we have in Southern California, these beautiful kelp forests. So brown algae is also, some examples are like rockweeds, kelp, sargassum weed. Most of these species are marine and not freshwater. They actually have fucoxanthin in them, which covers up the green pigments, and that's why they appear brown. They are very diverse and abundant, especially along the coastlines and higher latitudes. Most of them are temperate, although sargassum weed, which creates awesome habitat, like you see here, it's like a weed that grows on top of the water surface, and you can see all the animals below it that it makes these cool little habitats for, and also provides food for them out floating in the middle of the ocean. But this particular sargassum has taken off and grown too much recently. And here's an NBC News sargassum seaweed taking over beaches in Florida, Mexico, and the Caribbean that you can see when it kind of goes a little too crazy and grows too much, what that looks like. So the structure of brown algae is that it has a holdfast onto the rock. It has a stipe and blades. An important change here is that it actually has these air bladders at the surface, or I guess where the blade meets the stipe, it will have an air bladder, and that's to help it to float, obviously. But when you find these dead in like Southern California, a lot of times people pop these because it'll make a loud sound. Alginates are in it, and it makes it strong and flexible in the waves. And then it also has trumpet cells inside that takes the product of photosynthesis and brings it deeper into the kelp, into different areas, so that everything can be nourished with that. So these have small bumps on the outside called conceptricles, and then these chambers, they are little chambers where the gametophytes grow. And the sperm on these are actually have a flagellus, so they're actually mobile, and they can move and they can swim to the eggs, which are non-mobile in brown algae, and they can join up and make a zygote for the algae. So brown algae is extremely important in the areas that it's found as habitat, as in like a kelp forest, or like even the floating sargassum makes habitat. Even though it's in really high numbers right now, it is important as an ecosystem. Humans actually use brown algae as a thickening agent. Interesting, brown algae actually pulls iodine out of the water and concentrates it in its tissues. So a lot of times it is harvested for iodine. It's used as food or cattle feed. Here's a cool video by Ruben Murcia, brown, red, and green algae that you can check out. So believe it or not, there are a limited few number of flowering plants in the ocean, and it's hard to think of where is there flowering plants in the ocean. They are part of vascular plants, which are distinguished by having a phloem that carries water, minerals, and nutrients throughout the plants, and xylem that acts as structure for the plants and usually will carry some water as well. So there's two types of seed-bearing plants, conifers and flowering plants. Okay, conifers with cones, they're only on land. But there are a few halophytes, flowering plants, that are found in the ocean, and one example of that is seagrass. So hydrophytes are water plants, and there's a few different families here. that I'm going to mention. The first family is eelgrass or surf grass. The second is Poseidonia, and that is found in the Mediterranean and Australia, right along the coast. It grows really well. Then the third is manatee grasses and shoal grasses. Then the fourth is paddle grasses and turtle grasses, like you see here. And I should have pointed out, this is an example of the manatee grass that you find. Then there's two other families, but they each only have one species. So that's where number 5 and 6 come up. That's the ditch grasses and the horned pondweed, and only one species of each of those exists in the ocean. So there's a certain example of these called chara, and chara grow in these dense mats in really brackish, kind of dirty water and ditches, and they are more complicated than green algae, but their genetics are more like that of a land plant. Here's a video by Fico Stewart, The Life Cycle of Chara, a freshwater green algae. This is how the freshwater relative reproduces, but the ocean relative is pretty similar, which is why I included that video there. So inside of seagrasses, they have something really important called the arenchyme. And the arenchyme is a grass-filled structure that helps the plant stay buoyant, and it's broken down into different parts. So we're going to talk about the arenchyme for a minute. The arenchyme have these individual little pockets called the lacuna. And the lacuna are these open spaces where carbon dioxide and oxygen can be exchanged with the outside environment and cells. And you'll see that it's actually separated. The lacuna are separated in these pockets that are joined together by these pores. And that becomes really important. These also not only help them exchange gases, but help them to stay buoyant so they stand upright. Additionally, sea grasses, they accumulate tannins in them that gives them a brown tint, and it's also antimicrobial. Okay, back to these arenchyme. So I want you to think about, if there are, in the last pictures, couple of pictures, we showed some manatees eating them. We showed some sea turtles eating different grasses. And when they do, if they bit off the top, and this part almost looks like it was bit off, if you can think about that, if the a sea turtle or manatee came and bit this off, water would immediately fill this whole chamber, and gas exchange would now become impossible, and the plant would drown and not be able to stand upright. So evolutionarily, one adaptation has been that it now is separated by a pore. This pore is so tight that gas can get through, but water cannot. So this is a really cool adaptation that, yes, when it gets eaten, the top lacuna will get flooded, but not the lower chambers. And altogether, this is called the arenchyme, and you will see this not just in seagrass, but in some of the other plants that we're about to talk about. So remember that, because it is important. Okay, so seagrass reproduce a few different ways. One is by fragmentation, where it breaks off a chunk, it floats away, and then it reroots itself. It also can have flowers that are pretty hidden at the base. They can also have hydrophilous pollination, where a sperm floats over to a female flower, and they actually have some viviparity as well, where the seedling starts growing inside the mother before it is released. So some important parts about seagrasses is they are producers, so they're making plant material to be used in the community. They also stabilize sediments. They reduce turbidity and get rid of a lot of the dirt and cloudiness in the water that makes it difficult to breathe and see for other organisms. And it also, reducing turbidity helps with photosynthesis of other organisms. They provide habitat, and humans use them for insulation, packaging material, food, medicine, fuel, all kinds of things. Here's two cool videos to check out. One is by Marine Diary, Seagrass Beds, Prairies of the Sea, and the other one is a video by Sea Things NTV, Impact Caused by Anchors on Seagrass Beds. So this is actually a quick little video that was uploaded by scuba divers, just showing that they dove down and then they saw a cruise ship that dropped anchor, and then it's being drug across the seagrass bed, and you can see how it increases turbidity, and you can see the different animals that kind of get affected and chewed up by that. Now, some people think that's not that big of a deal, where other people think that's a really big deal and shouldn't happen. Okay, there is one group of plants called the salt marsh plants, and they are less adapted to marine life, meaning they're usually at the openings of different rivers or lagoons where they're getting a lot of fresh water. They're not always under high tide, like they'll stay up way higher onto land so that sometimes during low tide, they're not exposed to all that salt water. So they're kind of like midway in between like land and ocean in the way that they live. So different types are like the smooth cordgrass, and we're going to talk, they have like two parts, the culm and the tillers, that are found in other plants as well. They also have that aerenchyme, the pockets of like lacuna inside that separate them and allow for oxygen and help it to not get flooded. They do have flowers that are wind pollinated, and they drop seeds into sediment to regrow. So back to the culm and tiller. So this is found in other plants as well on land, but it is found in cordgrass. So the culm is basically the main shaft of the plant, and then it'll grow these tiny little, so here's the culm in this one. And it'll grow these smaller pieces off to the side that are tillers. So this is an example of two culms and lots of tillers that you can separate out the two different parts. So most salt marsh plants are facultative halophytes, which means they can tolerate salt or fresh water. They'll have a super thick cuticle so that they don't let out a lot of their fresh water that they already have inside. Think like a cactus. They also have something like that. They have very vascular tissues. They have salt glands that actually secrete and get rid of salt, which is a really cool adaptation where they can like kick out the extra salt that is inside of them. They are really important ecologically because they contribute to the food chain. They also stabilize sediment, so mud isn't constantly flowing. They make habitat. They contribute to the cycling of phosphorus. They remove extra nutrients. So when different farming and runoff from land comes down into the ocean, they kind of stop it there and they use it before that unnatural flow gets into the ocean. And they are used as food by crabs and terrestrial plants. Okay, one of my favorites is actually the mangroves. So there's three main families of these, and then there's also just like one that kind of hangs out, but it's not actually one of them, called the buttonwood. So buttonwood is called a mangrove associate. It is not actually a mangrove. It doesn't have the same reproductive structures or root characteristics, but it seems to want to hang out with mangroves a lot. So we're just going to lightly mention it here. But other types of real mangroves are like the red mangrove, which you can see in this picture, really grows deeper in the water. And in those spaces, it gets really flooded at different points during the day. So its root systems will really hold it up really, really high above the water line, which is cool. It's really awesome, and it makes this whole habitat down below. The black mangrove is called black mangrove because its bark is a lot darker than like the red or the white mangrove. And the black mangrove usually grows up more out of the water, and it is different than the red and the white because it will actually send down its roots, and it does have prop roots that kind of hold it up, but not nearly as big as the red. But then it has this extra thing where it actually sends its roots, it loops down and back up out of the water and out of the mud to help it breathe. So it helps like stabilize and comes back up, which is really cool. And I'll show you some pictures of that. And then there's the white mangrove that grows the highest up. Well, actually, you can have the black is shown in two different spaces because it can be deeper in the water or it can be further up on land. White is usually generally higher up where it's only lightly covered with water during the day. It has less of a prop root and it doesn't have the roots that circle back up like the black mangrove. And then there's buttonwood that is just always hanging out nearby. So these guys actually thrive on shores where there is not huge waves on these shores. It's pretty calm, like a lagoon type of place. So not a ton of wave action. They don't like huge slopes. They do hold in sediment really, really well, hold in dirt and soil. And that's really, really important because in areas where they've been chopped down, the land just washes away. Tons of the land just washes away. It lives in soils that are totally wet and waterlogged like mud all the time and anoxic, meaning it has almost no oxygen and very high salts. They tend to grow in very low latitudes near the equator. And a group of mangrove trees together will make a mangrove swamp, or also called a mangle. If you look here, you see in this picture that this is got very dark roots, meaning this is a black mangrove, and you can see how the parent plant is up here, but then these roots are circling back up in the water. Now, right now, they're completely covered in water, but I would guess in this space that there are points in the day where the tide is low and these are exposed to the air. So they have very simple leaves, but they have very complex roots, obviously. The roots a lot of times are aerial, meaning they're in the air, they're above the ground, and they do have that aerenchyme, those air pockets for gas. So they also have these little bumps. When you look closely, and you can almost see it here on this black mangrove, they have these little warty-like bumps all over their root system, and those are called lanictals, and they're scar-like openings that will allow for gas exchange to happen in the roots. So a prop root will give general support down, and it basically connects different roots down below. You'll have the lanictals, which are like the little warty places on them that allow for gas exchange. You'll have an anchor root that really just, its job is just to hold the tree into the sediment. You'll have cable roots that are connecting multiple, like here, a cable root will connect multiple roots together. And then you'll have the pneumatophores, which we saw, which are the pieces of the black roots that come back up out of the water for air. And here's another bigger picture of what that looks like. The anchor root holds it in place. The nutritive roots will obviously bring it more nutrients, and these little warty dots like the lanictals will allow for gas exchange. Their leaves are very leathery and thick and very plain oval looking leaves. So they have stomata that are for gas exchange, but they also have salt glands on the leaf that allow the plant to push salt out of it, making these awesome salt crystals all over the leaves. Interesting. In this picture, you can see some green leaves that are younger. You can see a yellow leaf that's probably older, and a brown leaf that is like fully dead at this point, okay? So as a mangrove goes through its life cycle, if a leaf is getting old and is about to die, it not only will push salt through the salt glands, but it will push salt to the dying leaf and just say, hey, it's going to fall off anywhere ways. Let's send a bunch of our salt there. So a very high salt concentration in the dead leaves. Another place it pushes its salt is actually into the sap, and the sap, it will push to the non-living parts of the plant, so it just stays away from the living tissue. So it actually has a super salty sap that it hides away from everything else. So they have very simple flowers that are pollinated either by wind or bees. They have buoyant seeds. So crazy. They actually have some version of viviparity where they have a new living plant. The baby plant is born and is alive and is growing on the parent. So the black mangrove actually does that, and you can see its seeds here. These aren't just seeds, these are actually baby plants, and they're growing on the parent plant until eventually they get big enough that they fall off and float away and plant themselves. This is called a propagule, and this is on red mangroves, and it's this cool little torpedo looking piece, and it's already a red mangrove that is already growing, and it stays attached to the parent until the parent's finally like, no, you get out of here. I'm evicting you. And it will send it down like a torpedo that will go float away and find a place to plant itself and live on its own. Now, white mangrove isn't nearly as interesting. It actually does not have that, but it does have these seeds that are kind of almond shape. So that's how you can tell if you see these out there between the different seed parts. So mangrove areas are so important for stabilizing sediments. Different epiphytes, meaning other plants will live on the aerial roots. Mangroves provide a canopy for insects and birds down in the water. Like here you see like some baby shark growing and using this as a nursery. A lot of animals do. The mangrove leaves, fruit, and propagules are all food that different animals eat. Here's a manatee that is coming up out of the water, like pushing up to feed on mangroves. And here's a little crab that's doing the same. So, and they also produce dead and decaying matter with their leaves, and all of that is a food source that ultimately gets used in other places. So mangroves are very important. We actually have a whole video about their ecological role coming up where we talk about them more in depth. So this is a video inside the mangrove forest by Khalid bin Sultan, Living Oceans, that I recommend you check out. It's a good one. So that concludes our video on multicellular primary producers. I do hope that you get to visit a cool place like this Southern California brown kelp forest. They're so mysterious and they're so important ecologically. And as you get to swim through there, it's just such an awesome, surreal feeling that you never know what's around the next corner.